you. Hello, good evening. Thank you all for coming and joining us tonight for a very exciting talk, intriguing talk too, by Christina Crawford. I'm Timothy Hyde, and so welcome on behalf of the History Theory Criticism Group, which I direct currently, and which is one of the two sponsors of Christina's talk. The other is the Department of Architecture, and so we're very grateful to Nicholas DeMoncho for co-sponsorship, to Joel Carella and Amanda Moore for also organizing and staffing the lecture tonight, and most of all to Christina for agreeing to come and visit with us. Let me offer first MIT's land acknowledgement to you, and then I'll give a brief biography, and we'll start to hear from Christina. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected from time immemorial to this land on which we now gather. Our speaker tonight is Christina Crawford, who is currently the Massey Martin NEH Professor of Art History at Emory University. Christina is an architectural historian and urban historian, but in previous careers has also been a practicing architect and also worked for the US State Department as a vice consul in St. Petersburg, so has a long experience of the region that she'll be talking about tonight. Her research in general focuses on the transnational exchange of ideas about housing and urban forms in the 20th century. Much of that research, the first stages of that research, is compiled and now available in her recent book, Spatial Revolution, Architecture and Planning in the Early Soviet Union. A piece of that research and that book is what Christina will talk to us about tonight. Christina is also the co-editor of Detroit, Moscow, Detroit, An Architecture for Industrialization, 1917, 1945, shortly forthcoming from MIT Press. She is also now writing a book on the interwar and New Deal exchange of housing design expertise between US and Europe, using Atlanta, where she's based at Emory University, as a primary node within that early exchange. Christina received her PhD as well as her MArch from Harvard University, and has had a surfeit of awards and fellowships and so on for since then, but we're very excited to hear the research and engage in the discussion tonight. So if you'll please just join me in welcoming Christina, we'll begin.
Thank you, Timothy. Just 1 second. And thank you all for coming. It's, I know it's the end of the semester and everyone's running on fumes. So I'll try to tell you a good, interesting story. And the lecture is about 50 minutes, if I don't go off script too much. So what you're looking at here, and you have been looking at for some time now, is a drawing for a steel factory complex in southeastern Ukraine. It was designed in 1930. It opened in 1933. At its inception, the plant was merely called the Mariupol Steel Factory. It's now called Azovstal, or Azov Steel, named for the sea on which it sits, which offers easy shipping access to the Kamysh-Burun's iron ore deposits on the Kerch Peninsula of Crimea. So once fully built out, the factory territory was 11 square meters, or over 4 square miles. It was known in Mariupol as a city within the city. In addition to what sits on the surface, the plant has a 5-level basement complex, 36 bomb shelters, and 24 kilometers of tunnel system that sit 30 meters below ground. And before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began in the end of February 2022, the plant employed more than 10,000 people. Now, if you followed the war, Azovstal might sound familiar. And if it does, it's because the factory was the site of the Ukrainians' last stand in the siege of Mariupol in spring 2022. And this is the state of the devastated site now. So sitting in Atlanta, watching this terrible drama unfold and feeling basically helpless to do anything except donate to Ukrainian causes, which is very easy to do, and I'm going to give you some options when I finish. I decided that perhaps my utility was simply to be an architectural historian, to offer context for this site based on my own research of early Soviet industrial architecture and planning. So I pulled down my Handbook of Industrial Construction, a real page turner, as I'm sure you can imagine, published in the USSR in 1935. And of course, I found it. The fact that Azovstal was in these pages was not a surprise, nor was the fact that the design for Azovstal was based on the massive steel plant in Gary, Indiana, completed in 1908, and a model for many Soviet steel complexes built in the 1930s. So I took that photo. I added some broader context about the intense technical exchanges between the Soviet Union and the US, Germany, and other capitalist countries during the time that Azovstal was built, and I posted. The response was absolutely remarkable, and from all corners of the globe. And it sort of, it was a sort of community, let's say, of people who were very interested in this particular site, but also the kind of origin story of the broader context. And it was really one of those rare moments when history and the present converge, and when it feels like the work that we do as scholars can somehow be of larger service. So in that vein, for you, I exceed 280 characters to offer a deeper view of the Russian war on Ukraine, specifically through the lens of industrial architectural history. And I should mention, like, there was, when Timothy and I were talking about when I could come and talk to his class and give this talk, we decided May 1st was a great day. And so I'm appreciating very much the sort of labor advocacy that's going on outside. So anyway. Now, before I go any further, I want to stress that my Ukrainian colleagues are undertaking this service of sort of writing architectural history to provide context for the present war, and you should seek out their work. So Dom Publishers out of Berlin, so the two images on the left, they're publishing a slate of books on Ukrainian architecture by Ukrainian architecture researchers. On the top right is an article by my friend Sofia Diak, who is the director of the Center for Urban History in Lviv. And it's her center's website, just a snap of that below. Sofia is a true public historian. She writes very beautifully in this open access article that you see here in Architectural Histories. And I'm just going to quote her. She says, "My contribution comes from my perspective as both a scholar and a witness, embedded in the contingency of the unfolding war in my home country." And Sofia's expertise in post-war architecture, she focuses on the post-World War II reconstructions. And this particular expertise, of course, is now unfortunately vital, and she feels the weight of that responsibility. So I ask you please to read her and other Ukrainian historians of the built environment. Now in this talk, I'll attempt very much from afar to answer a question. So why does Azovstal and Eastern Ukraine more broadly matter so much in this war? And to address this question, I'll unfold an architectural history of the foundational period in which the factory was designed and built. This extractive and industrial landscape is crucial territory for both sides, and its history engages politics, economics, and the built environment. I'll use the Kharkiv tractor factory, another industrial site of this very era that's featured in my recent book, to dive deeply into the context. And the takeaways from the Kharkiv site can really be extrapolated to other 1930s industrial sites in eastern Ukraine like Azovstal, and even to a certain degree kind of broader sites in Soviet territories. So as Timothy mentioned, the material for this talk comes from two books. I tell the Kharkiv story in Spatial Revolution, which is my first monograph. It's one of 3 sites that I look at, which include Baku, present-day Azerbaijan, Magnitogorsk in present-day Russia, and then Kharkiv in present-day Ukraine. My understanding of 1930s technical exchanges was deepened in my research for the second book, Detroit, Moscow, Detroit, co-edited with Jean-Louis Cohen and Claire Zimmerman, that will be published by MIT Press this August. In my chapter for that book, I read a slew of memoirs that had been written by American technical consultants who worked for the Soviet government in the 1930s, and they actually were page turners. They're pretty good. So even though I'm a historian of architecture and planning, I began my career as a practicing architect and urban designer. And so the questions that I ask in my scholarship are certainly inflected by that time as a practitioner. And namely, I'm interested specifically in how designers operate in particularly kind of transitional or unstable times, like the early Soviet Union or the American New Deal. And what I found, at least in these 2 moments, is that experimentation, research, precedent sharing, knowledge exchange is particularly robust. And we see the iterative looping interaction between ideation and materialization of the kind of architectural practice at its rawest state. So turning to Kharkiv. This image is from around 1929. It's just outside of Kharkiv, which was at that time the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This aerial is of a Zhilkombinat, or living combine, and I'll sort of play this all out in a bit, but just to give you a little preview. It's certainly an aspirational drawing. You can see the sort of trope of the airplane kind of swooping in from the right here. It also happens to be quite accurate to the final built version. Now, the Kharkiv tractor factory and its socialist city that you're looking at here were implicated in this massive Soviet industrialization drive in the late 20s and early 30s. And the architectural tactics that were employed by the designers on this site, intense architectural and urban design standardization, significantly impacted Soviet development for the following 50-plus years. Now, on February 24th, 2022, the first day of the most recent stage of this war, which began in 2014, a missile landed on the playground of this site, and the windows were blown out of a 6-story housing bar, just like the one you've seen in this aerial drawing. So like Azovstal, Kharkiv too has again become implicated in Moscow's expansionist efforts. So there are 3 layered contexts that ground this story of industrial architecture and architectural industrialization. So first, I'll sketch out the political context. I'll introduce you to the city of Kharkiv when it was served as the first Soviet Ukrainian capital. It's a place where architecture was called on to establish the city's role as a new socialist metropolis, filled with intellectuals. It's a university city, and skilled labor. And adjacent to the important commodities of grain and coal. Second, I'll discuss the economic context of the first 5-year plan, the FYP in my shorthand, which was the USSR's hyper-industrialization drive from 1928 to 1932. The plan happened to coincide with the global economic depression and the near collapse of the construction industry in the US. So foreign architects and engineers out of work were driven into the welcoming arms of the Soviet state, who were keen for their expertise. So at Kharkiv, Americans and other foreign experts arrived to help very swiftly design and construct a tractor factory on the city's outskirts. And then third, I'll analyze how architectural standardization learned at the factory was then employed at the residential component of the project. The design for the socialist city, which was called New Kharkiv, adjacent to the factory, also employed architectural standardization for not only the residential buildings, but also social service buildings, the kindergartens and schools and the workers' clubs, and then even repeatable urban blocks to house the workers. And the larger argument that I'm making here, that I make in the book, is that in the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet system harnessed these design tools of standardization and mass production that first emerged in industry, moved into architecture, and finally into planning. So what we have is this expansion from the tractor to the factory to mass housing and ultimately to repeatable urban units. And it's this final stage, the urban standardization, that is what made Soviet industrial expansion throughout Ukraine and then kind of eastward across the Eurasian continent possible. And it is, a lot of terms are very fraught these days, but I'm going to use the term. It's a kind of imperial drive. It was in the Soviet period as well, to expand into sort of unoccupied territories that we're seeing the latter-day effects of today in the Russian war in Ukraine. So, to begin with the political context. Kharkiv is located in northeastern Ukraine. It's about 32 kilometers or 20 miles from the Russian border. Now, the Bolsheviks claimed Kharkiv as the capital of Soviet Ukraine as early as December 1917, while Kyiv, the former imperial-era capital, stood as the contesting administrative center of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Now, when the dust settled in the aftermath of the Civil War, Kharkiv became the sole capital of Soviet Ukraine. And it was in some ways a classic situation, kind of new political regime, new capital. But where most commonly, say, Abuja, Astana, Brasilia, right? The new capital, where the new capital is kind of moved closer to the territorial center of the nation. Here it was very much moved eastward. So why? Kharkiv boasted qualities that made it an attractive choice for this new Ukrainian Bolshevik capital. So going back to the 1880s, Kharkiv was the logistics center of mining in this region, and it was the control center of the Southern Railway. And the city stood to play an even more significant role in the early Soviet period as the transit and administrative center of the Donetsk industrial basin, otherwise known as the Donbas. In the city was a considerable population of Russian-speaking factory workers already living there. And most importantly, it was a city that had an incredible industrial potential. So from 1922 to 1934, it's 12 years as the capital. Post-revolutionary Kharkiv proved an excellent site to test socialist space-making and iconography. The city had an expanded political role, obviously, and its population and industry increased precipitously. So this chart from 1932 plots 12 categories of growth from 1913, kind of forward to 1932, and projects their continued rise into the 1940s. So you can see, I look at this, right, as a former architect or planner, and I see construction of new governmental buildings, housing, hospitals, schools, modern infrastructure of all sorts. This was all needed, and the Soviet state seemed poised to provide them. Now, the historical parts of the city are the confluence of, does this work? Okay, of these two rivers right here. So this is the kind of the historical core. As part of the kind of Soviet plan, capital plan, there's a whole new city center that was designed and built up here. And this is the location of Plosha Svobody, or Freedom Square, the 8th largest plaza in Europe. For what it's worth, it is huge. And I want you to notice over here, we're just going to be looking at this building, which is at the end of that circular plaza. In 1925, an all-union competition was held for the design of this first and most prominent governmental building in Kharkiv, called the Derzhprom, or the State Industry Building. And that's the building, of course, we just saw holding the end of the plaza. It's sometimes referred to as the first, perhaps the only constructivist skyscraper. It is an absolutely remarkable building. that is compositionally very lively. It has this variable massing, 6 to 12 stories, and at the ground, the building splits and 2 city streets kind of pass beneath it. And then the buildings are reconnected by skyways at various levels to represent kind of, cooperative collaboration in concrete and glass. And this was just recently renovated just before the war. There are many other constructivist buildings, including the post office here, copious multi-unit housing projects built before the capital was then transferred to Kyiv in 1934. And I just want to mention, if you're at all interested in this, there's a beautiful website, both in Ukrainian and in English, by Ukrainian architectural researchers who have plotted and done just remarkable archival research about all of these buildings, many of which have been very, very severely not totally destroyed, but have been sort of affected by the bombing there. Now on to economics. So obviously, early Ukrainian Soviet architectural production, was inextricably tied to political conditions, like Capitol building, but also to specific economic conditions. An important point that I can't stress enough, and maybe it goes without saying, but I think actually it doesn't, is that not all socialist economies are the same. In the period that I look at in the book, 1920 to 1932, the Soviet Union passed through 3 very distinct economic periods, and these are being sort of charted on the bottom of the timeline here. So from 1917 to 21, war communism, which was a very kind of quick to full socialization of the economy, complete disaster. The new economic policy, or NEP, ran from 21 to 28. And that was what is now known as kind of state capitalism. So it was a combination of kind of socialist economy for kind of large parts of the economy, and then small scale shops and businesses were allowed to coexist. And then in 1928 to 32, we move into the first 5-year plan, which was kind of rapid then turn again to a full socialist command economy. And this is where we'll be kind of spending our time here. So during the first 5-year plan, the Soviet government pumped massive state funding into industrial projects. And the aim, per Stalin's directive, was to, in 5 years, which, by the way, they were so good they completed in 4, if you haven't done the math, was to catch up and overtake capitalism. So each icon in this projective first 5-year plan map is a new or existing industrial slated to be either constructed or expanded during the plan. This is an enormous undertaking in 5 or 4 or 20 years, for that matter. And many of the locations earmarked for heavy industry were, in fact, undeveloped sites of mineral wealth, very far removed from existing transportation infrastructure. So under these circumstances, architectural standardization became a key component of Soviet national planning and industrial development. So these kind of pop-up industrial complexes, which were a purview of American expertise, jibed with Soviet aspirations to develop these far-flung production sites, and very rapidly. So, back to Ukraine. Now, I mentioned before the Donetsk Industrial Basin, or the Donbas. And this plan of the first, or this sort of projective map, let's call it, because this is a wish image, right? That this is projective. This is not necessarily what happened, but this is what was desired to happen in those 5 years. There are only 3 sites that got their own kind of zoomed in special maps. Leningrad, Moscow, and the Donetsk Basin. Equally important as the mineral resources of coal and iron ore in the Donbas was the grain that was harvested in the Ukrainian agricultural heartland just beyond Kharkiv's borders. And the grain was sold on international markets to fund these heavy industrial projects. So agriculture and industry became kind of inextricable from one another. So you have to remember this fact, that grain was the primary Soviet export that made the construction promised in these maps possible. Propaganda from the first 5-year plan period often highlighted industrializing projects in southern and eastern Ukraine as key to the success of the Soviet industrialization effort. So what you're seeing here is Crimea on the left, the Donbas on the right. And of course, these two areas of Ukraine have been under Russian occupation since they were illegally annexed in 2014. Now, the ambitious timetable set for the first 5-year plan by the Soviet states' economic planners did not allow for a period of internal research and development. Industrial architecture was already well established in the US by that time. So I'm showing you here, probably many of you have seen this image. It's Ford's River Rouge plant just outside of Detroit. And I include it because it's a project that was very well known to and frequently visited by Soviet industrial planners. American expertise in this realm was coveted by the Soviets. And indeed, in the 2 decades after the revolution, up to 80,000 foreign workers, specialists, and political exiles traveled to work in the Soviet Union. I love this photo because it sort of like encapsulates so much here. So the caption tells you that this is Nizhny Novgorod, or what became Gorky, which was the site of a Ford factory in the Urals. And that every fedora that you can find is an American who has come to work on this factory. A precise number is extremely difficult to establish, but there were likely around 2,000 American technical consultants working for the Soviet government between 1928 and 33, and a peak of that exchange occurred in 1931. Now, the bulk of these technical consultancies in the USSR, of course, began after October 1929, the stock market crash. And this is just showing you the indices of industrial production, of course, in numerous countries at the time. And I just sort of clipped right here on the right to show you, I mean, it's very straightforward. Like, the USSR was on the rise, and the US was taking a dive. So this economic collapse in the capitalist world conspired to lock American and Soviet industry together mutually and, in fact, beneficially. The Soviet government took advantage of the near stoppage of US industrial development during the Depression to draw American assistance on the first 5-year plan projects. Detroit, in particular, played host to a stream of Soviet visitors seeking US firms and individuals with whom to partner. Albert Kahn, the architect of Henry Ford and the Rouge, was targeted by the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy precisely because of his firm's legendary speed. So using standardized architectural types and with all design departments working in parallel as opposed to kind of in sequence in his firm, Albert Kahn, Inc. could crank out the plans for a factory in the matter of days. So Kahn's firm was contracted by the Soviet government. Whoops, sorry. Uh-oh. There we go. To design a single tractor factory for Stalingrad that I'm showing you here. And architectural types like the forge shop, which I know much too much about now. These types are already tried and tested on US projects and simply adjusted, so like very slightly tweaked for Soviet conditions. In Kahn's archive at the University of Michigan sits this really remarkable construction administration scrapbook that was put together for their architect by Soviet colleagues on site. And this project was a success at Stalingrad. And it led to a 2-year agreement between the Soviet government and Albert Kahn, Inc. that made the Detroit firm consulting architects for all industrial construction in the USSR for a period of 3 years. Tractors were a critical piece of machinery necessary to meet the grain extraction goals of the plan. There were not nearly enough, and most were in fact imported from the US. What this is a chart of projected tractor production increase just for Kharkiv over the year 1929. And this was just kind of going through extremely dry kind of reports that I put this together. So from January to December, the tractor targets increased by 500%. And very important to understand, these are projections. These are not output. So Kharkiv's small existing tractor factory could not keep up, and a bigger factory needed to be built. So in November 1929, a memorandum was drawn up by the regional industrial planners on the choice of Kharkiv as the site for the construction of a new southern tractor factory. The report opened with a list of preconditions for this factory, which included the guarantee of a 15-month construction period and assurance that full production of 50,000 tractors would be met in the 2 years' time. So this timeline left a scant 7 months to prepare the drawings, the site, and the labor pool to construct this factory and the adjacent residential settlement, or Sotsgodet, socialist city. Miraculously, it was more or less completed on that breakneck schedule through architectural standardization, but a very particular kind of Soviet-inflected standardization. So the plan was to copy Kahn's Stalingrad tractor factory on the left exactly for Kharkiv on the right. As you can see, it's 180 degrees. And the only way to make that, because this was the only way that this impossible schedule could be met. The form and the dimensions of the plan, exactly the same. But there were many alterations that had to be made for the Kharkiv factory, including a significant material change from steel to concrete. So it's effectively a different building, but kind of has the same DNA. And this process by which a standard type is modified, sometimes fairly significantly, to accommodate local conditions, has a specific name in Russian the origin of which is from this time, and it's called привязка, or architectural adjustment. So the massive Kharkiv tractor factory complex was able to begin production of tractors so swiftly because the factory itself was the product of standardization. Soviet-inflected, contingent привязка, but standardized all the same. And here you can see that these are concrete buildings with the Kahn daylight system, that kind of triangular lighting that's a hallmark of Kahn. So the lessons of assembly line mass production of the object, the tractor, were assumed and implemented to the production facility itself, the factory, with the help of American industrial architects and engineers. In total, Kahn's office records confirm that 531 factories, based on their drawings and specifications, were completed in the USSR by the time their consultancy was over. Again, I said 3 years, but it's actually just 2, 531 complexes in 2 years. And the number of unconfirmed facilities based upon plans or details developed by Kahn's office is likely in the thousands. So the Soviet state design institutes just absorbed American typologies and details and carried them well into later decades through strategic adjustments from site to site. And the built result was a collection of industrial complexes that resembled one another, let's say like siblings, but certainly not like twins. The relationship between the Gary steel plant and Azovstal can be understood also in terms of Privязка. So obviously the Ukrainian complex adjusted to the contours of the new site, but the project was also subject to differing material delivery and labor supply conditions that significantly affected the final architectural ensemble. As an aside, I became interested in this research to suss out what the Soviet experience kind of imparted to the foreign consultants. It's much harder to track. And is kind of a hypothesis, more or less. But I'm convinced that this episode, the sort of older historical scholarship calls this technical transfer, like, west to east, like, done. But I think that the American construction managers on Soviet sites like Azovstal or Kharkiv had to learn to actually think on their feet. They learned a kind of different set of skills in these very contingent sites and had to adapt themselves to less than ideal circumstances. So I think there was, at least in terms of methodology, let's say, something that returned. And this skill of rapid adaptation proved very useful when these engineers returned to the US to work on massive state construction projects during the New Deal, and most of them did end up on these New Deal projects. Okay, so built context. So I'm going to sort of talk about then how the lessons of architectural standardization learned from the factory then impacted the design of Soviet worker housing. So the industrial residential settlement was called New Kharkiv. The whole complex was built, if I can again get this to work, about 10 kilometers outside of the city on the long haul train line that connects the center of Kharkiv here out toward the Caucasus, right there. And this is the site that we'll be looking at right there. So the factory, which you can see on the top here, and the residential area, which is below, were designed by separate teams and ran on different schedules, but they're running kind of parallel to one another. So while the factory project team was working to adjust the Stalingrad plans to the sites, the new Kharkiv Sotsgorod, or Socialist City project, was assigned to the Ukrainian architect Pavlo Alyoshin. And with a team of young architects, they produced also the Socialist City with remarkable speed. The plan's distinctive form marks it as one of the only constructed examples of the theoretical model known as the Soviet linear city. So the linear city's main proponent, Nikolai Milutin, who happened to be sort of commissar of finance of the Russian Republic, he stressed that the new socialist settlement should be organized according to industrial principles. So he wrote, and I'll just quote him, "A flowing functional assembly line system is the absolutely necessary basis for the new planning. The residential sector of the settlement must be set up parallel to the productive zone and must be separated from it by a green belt, or a buffer zone. This protective strip must be no less than 500 meters wide." End quote, Milutin. So what you're seeing here is the green zone was intended to act as the sort of lungs of the project to filter any stray industrial particulates that might drift toward the residential zone. Each worker had a short 10 to 20-minute walk from the residential unit to the factory across the green zone. And then this green zone also structured rational linear growth of these sectors in either direction along the length while maintaining this optimal distance between them. This kind of linear growth was also virtually boundless. So you could imagine these sinuous lines of development just kind of snaking through Soviet territory. Curiously, this drawing that I found, again with like no textual sort of further information, so what we see is all we have. But it suggests that Kharkiv might be surrounded by such linear cities, I mean, just like a corona of these linear cities, running along these main transportation lines. But to the best of my knowledge, New Kharkiv, again, which is on the kind of lower right there, was the only one that was constructed. Now, an early version of the socialist city reveals this exact layering of program, except for flipping it 180 degrees. So it's divided into these parallel zones. In this case, we've got the heavy rail line on the top, the lightly penciled tractor factory in the production zone, 500-meter green zone, exactly. And then this residential zone composed of these kind of repeated blocks that are kind of populating the countryside to the south and the east. And this is before the destruction of the war, but you can see on this Google aerial, this is exactly how it was built. And you know, being sort of a urban theory nerd, I can't tell you like how exciting it was to actually sort of like walk through these spaces. And the tractor factory is effectively defunct now, but the urban fabric still acts kind of as it was intended and designed and theorized. Now, the socialist city was the name of the entire residential area across from the factory. It was composed of these repeatable blocks known as living combines or combinati. What you're seeing here is a close-up of 5 blocks, and you can see that they're just 3 block designs mirrored on this center line, each with a limited number of housing and social service building types. Each living combine was designed to hold 2,500 residents and accommodate all their basic needs. So kindergartens, schools, worker clubs, small shops were built into the block along with the housing. The socialist city was the name for the entire composition, all of the living combines together, and it was intended to reach a population of 25,000 to 50,000 residents. We've seen this before, but now you can see the kind of architectural language and constituent elements of this housing combine. The 2 narrow 6-story bars on the kind of front here hold dormitory-style living cells for singles. Just behind, there are 6 4-story bars that hold multi-room family units. And in the middle of this composition sits this round-nosed workers' club that was attached to a communal dining hall and mechanized laundry. At the back of the block are 4 identical educational buildings, elementary schools, kindergartens, nurseries, and there were shops and clinics and cinemas and recreational facilities also built into these blocks. The plans of the kind of tallest housing type show what the individual units were like. They were called living cells at the time, 6 square meters or 64 square feet. And you can see, I mean, it's a dormitory. You know, I show these to my undergrads, and they're like, it's a dormitory. I'm like, all right, it's a dormitory. So they, you know, shared bath and a certain amount of common areas, no kitchens. This is critical. Here on the right, you can see the furniture layout. It's intended primarily for sleeping, although there is a little tiny desk at which to read, a sink for washing up. But again, no kitchen. Now, as the poster from Soviet Ukraine makes clear, this was because life was to be lived in the public realm. So you eat with your comrades in the canteen, you recreate in the workers' club, you extract coal, you sleep, and repeat. So here we have views of New Kharkiv just after construction. Extremely generous exterior spaces. About 80% of the site was left open or unbuilt, giving the settlement a generous kind of green, porous landscape, and it still works this way. The architecture, I think we can say, is austere and filled with these tiny living cells. I can tell you anecdotally, of course it's quite difficult to hear or get access to the voices of the residents themselves, but anecdotally, we do know that the living cells were extremely unpopular. Walls were knocked down to make family apartments. Hot plates were smuggled into the kitchenless units. But the social infrastructure was successful, and it persisted through the Soviet era. And where the residential buildings were austere, the architecture of the social programming was exuberant. And this was because the residential and the social were understood as this integral package and in balance with one another. So kindergartens, which you're seeing in the color photos here, or the Workers' Club on the upper left, they were allowed to be idiosyncratic because it was their job in the urban unit to communicate the dynamic potential of communality. So here we see that the lessons learned from the factory standardization impact the design of mass-produced housing types. In my book, Kharkiv is the final site, and I largely paint it as an architectural success story for the reasons more or less embedded in this diagram. I also make clear, however, that it's very important to temper assignation of success to this project. And the war, I think, also demands full contextualization of the violence of the historical era in these such projects. So outside of the high brick wall that surrounded the factory, each entrance of which was guarded by a soldier with a loaded rifle and a fixed bayonet, was manufactured famine and genocide of the Ukrainian peasantry, known as the Holodomor, or the terror famine. So as you recall, grain grown in the Ukrainian countryside was earmarked as the primary Soviet export to fund capital projects like the Kharkiv tractor factory. But the peasants, most of whom ran small-scale subsistence farms, resisted by retaining their harvested grain. So export projections that were built into the economic model for the industrialization drive became untenable. As the historian Moshe Levine put it, the great risk to the Soviet state was that the countryside, if not properly controlled and mastered, could wreck the whole effort. So forced agricultural collectivization turned Kharkiv into a haunted city from 1932 to 1934, overpopulated by peasants whose villages were subsumed into this now collective territory. So they drifted into Kharkiv hoping to secure food, and instead many were rounded up by police and carted so far out of town that they could not return for exhaustion. Now, forced famine affected every corner of Ukraine. The Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute has mapped various data points from the Holodomor in their Great Famine project, and I'm sharing just two maps from that project. So this first shows blacklisted entities and districts in the country that suffered most during the period that the tractor factory, Azovstal, these other sort of first five-year plan projects are being constructed. The second is, to my mind, the most devastating map that quantifies Soviet Ukrainian deaths during this 2-year period of the Holodomor. So it was 4.5 million famine losses, which is made up of 3.9 million excess deaths and 0.6 million lost births. So these numbers should absolutely boggle the mind. So again, to be clear, this was a manufactured famine to force the peasantry into compliance with Soviet agricultural collectivization to bankroll industrial expansion. And my point in sharing this information is to make clear that Ukraine has been materially, physically impacted by these sort of conjectural choices by politicians from Moscow before. And also that, even though I'm periodically told to stay in my lane, I do think that as architectural historians, we're ethically obligated to interrogate the context that gave rise to our objects and sites of study. So I'll pull out just one more time to discuss the implications of Soviet design standardization on a continental scale. So just pulling out. So the Soviets were at pains to remind world leaders and their own population that the USSR constituted a full 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. That territory was only useful, however, if harnessed. So the immense natural resources and vast territories had to be reached and settled. And this task was one of the main drivers of the first 5-year plan. The plan was, in effect, an effort to take control of this landmass. So each icon here is an industrial settlement. How to quickly populate these dots on the map? Standardized urban units. So in the end, I think the first 5-year plan helps us to understand how architects and planners, in fact, became implicated in what historian Timothy Snyder and others deem the internal colonization of Soviet territories that expanded Russophone industrialization efforts to the north, south, and the east. So we reach the end of the standardization line from tractors to territory. So the logic of these pre-designed urban units quickly installed in nearly any condition was the answer to the Soviet desire to settle and make productive the land under their control. And the desire to replicate industrial concerns and residential quarters sort of quickly across these vast territories was fulfilled through really the interscalar standardization of architectural details, building types, and then settlement modules. I've shared with you Kharkiv. Kharkiv was not alone. Here in the pages from Oksana Chabanyuk's chapter in our Detroit book, you can see that the massive hydroelectric plant on the Dnipro River, just south of Kharkiv, also used these limited architectural types to generate pop-up cities for industrial worker populations in this area. So this project to control territory and settle the Soviet population dispersed patterns really came to fruition later in the 20th century after Stalin's death. Premier Nikita Khrushchev initiated a massive push to standardize and mass-produce residential buildings and neighborhoods. So these concrete panel high-rises that became synonymous with Soviet block housing was, I argue at least, a continuation of these standardization and dispersion efforts of the late 1920s and early 1930s. The housing, as you know, was constructed from a limited number of types. This is from a very well-known Soviet comedy here. So you know what we're talking about with this cartoon. So housing, obviously a limited number of types, but the neighborhood too was a packaged unit, replicable throughout Soviet and in fact sort of behind the Iron Curtain territories. The living combine was renamed the microregion, but the basic form and the principles were the same. So to conclude, Russia's present war has focused on eastern Ukraine not only or even primarily, I would say, because of its proximity to the Russian border. The incredible density of resources in the Donbas and throughout Ukraine hold a special place in the Russian imaginary. And Putin's administration is willing to undertake short-term destruction for long-term control. And this, of course, should sound familiar now in the situation, to the situation of Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s. And this, by the way, is just from a couple of days ago. Stolen Ukrainian grain, by the way, continues to serve Moscow's quest for land and power. So I'll finish where I began, at Azovstal and the present moment. So industrial sites like this are the legacy of previous violence inflicted on this territory. The rapid industrialization of Ukraine in the 1930s, to which this project belongs, was a deeply exploitative project that entailed brutality during and environmental degradation after its construction. This negative history is now, however, in dialogue with a countervailing narrative. So the Azovstal complex has become this material artifact and symbol of Ukrainian resistance. And its meaning has transformed through its persistence over nearly a century and ultimately through its utility to Ukrainians at war. So I think we should see in this industrial architecture Ukrainians' capacity to flip the script, such that buildings like these, which are clearly emblematic of the Soviet era in which they were built, still have the capacity to become representative of independent and sovereign Ukraine, absorbing new cultural and governmental entities and new everyday life. And in post-war reconstruction, these will assume new cultural import as sites and buildings that bore the brunt of Russian aggression. Thank you. And I promised I would to myself that I would do this. So there, if you want to donate, there are two kind of built environment organizations that I can recommend. One, the Kharkiv School of Architecture, which has been evacuated to Lviv, but is still training future Ukrainian architects, of course, who will be very important in the reconstruction effort. You can fund a student. And then Kharkiv is doing much more kind of on the ground, replacing windows in individual buildings and the like. So with that, go back here. Thank you.
And you'll take some questions?
Yeah, of course, sure.
Time for questions for Christina. You have a microphone you have to ask you to use so that it shows up in the recording. Raise your hand.
Thank you for illuminating the real estate in my mind that the Ukraine war occupies, which is a kind of dam against the U.S. political turbulent sea that would wash my brain into the sea. So this is absolutely fascinating, but being a historian, I'd like to take us backwards to the theme, your leitmotif of U.S. Soviet interchange, rather than, I think you called it technical transfer, the experimental on the ground learning that would become part of the New Deal, which is happening. When is this happening? Is it happening in the planning stage, or are these American engineers witness to the exploitative, brutal process of the famine and of the integration, if you can call it that, of these workers into the Soviet industrial machine?
Yeah. So I, as I mentioned in my chapter, well, so as I was doing research for the book, and especially for the Kharkiv site, but other sites that I looked at as well, it really surprised me how many Americans, Germans, Czechs, I mean, there were a lot of non-Soviet technical experts who end up kind of working in Soviet industrial projects. So for my chapter for the Moscow-Detroit book, I used as an excuse to just read all of these memoirs of American, and mostly engineers, who worked in the Soviet Union, and some of them for up to 2 years. So they were participants, I guess I would say, and there was some, in some of their memoirs, they hint at this kind of, let's say, terror that's happening kind of outside of the borders of these industrial sites. Some of them are quite explicit about it, and then some of them are just like, I don't want to know anything about the politics. I'm going to live in the American village, and I'm just going to keep to myself. I don't want to get involved. I'm just here in a mercenary, totally mercenary capacity. So it differed for various characters. But I would say, a lot of them who write these memoirs, they do end up coming back to the United States and immediately getting put to work on New Deal projects. So big hydroelectric projects, big state design, and construction projects of various types. So I think, it's a little bit, I can tell you that when I make this claim, historians of the New Deal like totally roll their eyes and they're like, that is complete bullshit. I was like, no, I actually don't think it is. I don't think it is. Yeah, no, I really don't think it is. And I think, what they talk about in these memoirs is the frustrations of working on these like rapid industrialization projects in the Soviet Union where they just can't get the materials that they need, that the labor is not up to snuff and the like. And I think it develops a certain kind of resilience that they bring back to these New Deal sites. I can't prove it though, I have to be honest.
Am I right? Are we ending up with American engineers, previously intellectual cogs in the forge and the
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
organization go to the Soviet Union
Yeah.
and enable the whole machine?
And they sort of enable industrial espionage. I mean, it just.
And take their know-how and actual practical or patentable
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
elements, go to the Soviet Union, they import them. How they get into the Soviet system is probably another book. And then they go back, and what are they bringing back? The brutality, the master plan? Where is it going to go in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really complicated question. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the planning for these big projects is happening at a much higher level, but planners. Why am I totally blanking on his name? Very important. The one who's behind the Greenbelt cities, Rex Tugwell, is that right? Okay, so Rexford Tugwell, had been in the Soviet Union purely in a kind of touristic, as part of a group looking at Soviet planning, and then he comes back. I mean, he's really fascinated with, obviously big state planning projects, but it's like Rex Tugwell and those types are making the bigger plans from the United States, and the engineers who are working in the Soviet Union coming back are at a much lower level for the most part. But they're actually working on these sites. They're actually working in the projects. So, yeah. Yeah, of course.
Thank you for an awesome lecture. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on the term привязка.
Привязка, uh-huh.
And is that related exclusively to industrial architecture, or did that expand to other typologies, perhaps housing?
I mean, for sure, yeah. So привязка, where is it here? I became totally fascinated by it because it is, it certainly was an operative term, not only a term, but like a method, effectively, like kind of a design method that became like totally ingrained in, Soviet design institutes, through the end of the Soviet period, and I think it's still used today, this term, and so certainly with mass housing after the Second World War, this привязка is the kind of operative method, and it's you take a very limited number of, let's say, mass housing types, and there's like wiggle room, or they can morph to a certain degree depending on climatological conditions, various types of site conditions and the like. But designers who are working within these state design institutes, what привязка does is it actually like the work of design becomes a work of tweaking, right? There's very and so that's probably not a very exciting job, right? But it does mean that you know, if your goal as a state is to house everyone, you know, absolutely limit your options and just tweak, 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 you know, like depending on whether you're in the Arctic Circle or you're in you know, Azerbaijan or in Kazakhstan, you're like tweak, 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 you know, and that's what's happening here. But I think it's learned in these industrial projects.
And as a brief follow-up, is this then a kind of ad hoc process happening on site, or kind of institutionalized within the pedagogy as a practice?
Yeah, right. That's a very good question. I would say in this early stage, it is fairly ad hoc on site. You know, so in this specific case, you know, they basically just like brought the drawing set from Stalingrad to Kharkiv, and the tweaks were going to be very, very minor. And then, but the problem with Stalingrad is that the whole factory, all of the components, all of the steel, everything was made in the United States and shipped to Stalingrad. And by the time they got to Kharkiv, that like was not sustainable. It was too expensive. It was too like logistically complicated. And so a decision is made, well, I guess it's going to be concrete. Whatever steel we can get our hands on for certain types of buildings, but it'll be concrete and brick because, by the way, we just built a brick factory and we might as well use those too. So I would say like in the early stages, it's totally ad hoc, but by the time we get to like post-war mass housing, it's totally institutionalized. Like this is the way that that architects work within state design institutes. So there's a kind of you know, a narrative arc perhaps to design methodology. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. It seems totally reasonable to me that the sort of bulk of your emphasis is on these questions of logistics and efficiency of the Privyatska system. But I'm also just interested, even like within the, you know, like central authority in Moscow, for example, to what extent the standardization is also a kind, even if austere, a kind of aesthetic agenda of visually consolidating the USSR, you know, like those totally standardized housing blocks, is it deemed valuable that they always look the same in terms of people feeling that they're participating in a, you know, continental scale political project, for example?
I don't know. That's a really interesting, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, you know, it becomes like a running joke, you know, because, you know, I highly recommend this this film, by the way, if we get her here. Irony of Fate. Have you seen this?
No, I haven't. But
okay, I highly. I mean, the premise. It's like a rom-com basically, but the premise is that you know, the male protagonist lives. I can't remember which is which. He lives in Leningrad, you know, you know, on, you know, Revolution Street, you know, building 5A, blah, blah, blah. He's out with his friends, he gets drunk, somehow he gets on a plane, you know, ends up in Moscow, and just goes, you know, tells the taxi driver, like, go to Revolution Street, you know, building 5. He gets to the apartment, his key works, you know, he goes in, and it sets into motion this whole, you know, and like the occupant of that flat, they fall in love, and it's all anyway. But so that's the joke, right? Is that no matter where you are, yeah, perhaps you will always be at home, right? But what, I mean, was this like an aesthetic? I don't know. That's a really good question.
I mean, in part I asked because
it's more like expediency, but
yeah, no, of course, expediency seems
right.
to be number one. But the precedent that seems really striking to me is the prior to, you know, the 30s, like in the 19th century, federal U.S. postal office and so on. Like, totally austere designs, but there's an idea that the same post office in every town is going to be part of the federal consolidation of the United States after the Civil War.
Right.
And I just wonder if there's something similar.
Yeah, I don't know. I have never thought about that, but I think that's pretty interesting. Yeah, perhaps. Right. That it's an infrastructure, the kind of like expression of which is known to everyone everywhere, and that has a certain it becomes a like cultural glue somehow, like the look of the architecture. I don't know. I'm not sure, but that's a good question.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating and totally out of my ken. I'm curious about the portrait you painted of the Ukrainians as peasants outside the factory walls.
Yeah.
And I want to press a little bit on that demographic and ask if you've encountered the Ukrainian elites who were perfectly happy to be part of the technical apparatus and to preserve the imperial vision. I mean, in other words, I'm imagining a precondition of a Tsarist membership that was okay with sliding over, and that the Soviet state was okay with them sliding over. So part of the pressure would be on the forms, and whether there's any Ukrainian thing going on here that I would not be able to recognize that you can tell me. Since so much of your talk is about a kind of resurgent flipping of the script, I'm a little suspicious of that. It may be a reclaiming of the script.
Reclaiming.
For a Ukrainian nationalism that was actually not that different from a Soviet nationalism. You know what I mean? I mean, peasants are peasants. We're the steel workers who run the technical apparatus, and we're happy to be, you know, holding our own. Anyway, your way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if we go back to this question of the famine, for instance, I mean, so in my like subfield, right, of maybe it's not even a subfield, but let's say, you know, kind of Slavic studies, perhaps, and then certainly those of us who look at Ukraine, there's been a sort of push to decolonize, right, the scholarship. But that's quite fraught because Ukraine was not a colony of Russia, and in fact there was a kind of a cultural elite who through education or other means were helping to take the grain from the peasant, right? So there are multiple levels of class here. I mean, this is the architect who designs the socialist city at New Kharkiv is Ukrainian, as are all of his students who are designing this, and certainly they see this going on. And do they do anything about it? I don't know. It's hard to, it's not in the record, so it's really hard to know. But I think, I mean, your point about it's not so easy as or so flip, as I said, the sort of flipping the script. I mean, I think one thing that you can say about Ukraine is that, if you take the super long historical view, this is a territory that has been run over so many times by so many different entities. What constitutes Ukrainian architecture is like almost impossible to say, because now it's Habsburgian, architecture is also Ukrainian architecture, and is it? Yes, I suppose. Tatar architecture in Crimea is also Ukrainian. Right? It becomes very, it does become very muddy. So perhaps it's not so much flipping; it's like absorption of various sort of cultures and regimes that have come across this territory. Maybe that's probably a better way to say it. Perhaps. No.
Maybe to tie things towards the end of your talk, ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on what the implications are of a swerve to a kind of heritage perspective on these same objects. And what I mean is the motive for that, I think you've laid out clearly. But given that in piecing together the story of the actual original constitution of these objects, of the factory, as being where the object is inseparable from production, is inseparable from design, is therefore inseparable from policy, from all of this. Heritage seems to be a device to step outside of that and and maybe to connect to the aesthetic, the question of the aesthetic too, to aestheticize in a different, not in that conventional sense of that term, but still to think of these as objects that have a singularity. They're not part of a system and so on.
Yeah.
So that swerve also, it seems to be doing something in terms of architectural, it seems to be posing a kind of architectural historical challenge as well. If the story that you present of the constitution of these objects is a kind of faithful history, what then is the participation of architectural history in turning it into a heritage moment, which seems to be cutting it away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right.
And I assume we're trying to, you're trying to do both, right? Bring these two things together.
Yeah.
And obviously it's in the it's in the context of a, deeply tragic and intolerable situation. So it's not to criticize heritage as such, but just ask if you could elaborate a little bit on how you think, is this two projects that really are cross purposes?
At cross purposes, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel totally like to some degree unequipped to answer that in a sort of suitably appropriate way, just because I'm not, my positionality as non-Ukrainian is fraught here, and I mean I can say, so for Ukrainian colleagues, architectural historians, for the past, 25 years since the Soviet Union fell, like really sort of digging in and really trying to understand the origin stories of these places outside of propaganda. Like what really happened here, and how are these built, and who was implicated, and who was destroyed in the construction of these places. Like that's been the work, let's say, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's definitely picked up, even I would say in the last 10 years or so. And so yes, like what do you do with that now? I think I don't know. I'm not sure. I think they are working a little bit at cross purposes. The uncovering of the sort of like, the implicit. I'm having a hard time getting my head around this. Actually, I don't know what the answer is going to be in the end. I don't know. But you're right. They're like.
When ambivalence seems to be an appropriate place to end.